Now, the Australian newspaper revealed today that during the COVID pandemic in Victoria, and boy, did I live through that, the Andrews government used focus groups set up by a strategy company, so they were paid, to profile Victorians into 5 categories. Now, that included those in Category 5 who opposed the lockdowns. They were described as believing, quote, tyrannical government is the enemy, who embraced fantastical conspiracy theories and chose individual rights ahead of collective rights. Well, let's bring in our panel to discuss this absolute joke. Joining me is the host of the Australiana podcast by The Spectator Australia, Will Kingston, and the IPA's Deputy Executive Director, Daniel Wild. Daniel, I guess that makes me one of Dan Andrews' conspiracy theorists.
Well, we're all conspiracy theorists now, Steve, apparently. But look, what's so concerning to me about this is it reinforces what you were talking about. I mean, you lived through the lockdown, Steve. I lived through them. So did millions of Victorians. And what this shows is that there was a deliberate strategy of the Daniel Andrews government to divide Victorians based on their political views and based on their values. It was a divide and conquer strategy, and they used that to scapegoat certain people who were speaking out against lockdowns and against mandates and against everything that was happening in Victoria. And it also goes to the point, Steve, that none of the COVID handling had anything to do with public health or the economic or social effects. It was all about politics, and it was all about making sure that Daniel Andrews' approval was going up and not down. And this is why we need to have a proper, full, transparent inquiry at all levels of government, because Australians were let down, and we need to make sure that nothing like this ever happens again.
Yeah, we need a royal commission into the COVID response of the states, and the states don't want to do it, or Canberra doesn't want to do it, because the states are all now run by Labor administrations. Now, Will, I mean, we had Richard Branson in town this week. I'm no great fan, but yesterday, and I quite like his comments yesterday, he took a swipe at the endless Melbourne lockdowns, longest lockdowns in the world, saying that Melbourne should have looked a lot more like Stockholm and less like Wuhan during COVID. And he pointed out the mental health damage done by young people. I suspect he was having a whack at the government because they just jacked up the port fees that all his cruise ships are going to have to pay to come in here. But he's probably right. Why couldn't we have been like Sweden?
Very good question, Steve, and I'm glad that he did raise the Stockholm example. I feel like I'm going crazy when I see a lot of the data now that emerges from the COVID period, where Stockholm or Sweden comes out at the top of most metrics, and yet lockdown apologists just want to wave it away as some uncomfortable reality. It is the path that we could have taken, and Daniel is right. You are right. People across Australia are still hurting. The effects of lockdowns when it comes to mental health is one of many ways in which the lingering effects of terrible government policies are hurting Australians. And the response of this panel so far, that we need a proper inquiry, a proper Truth and Reconciliation Commission to get these problems off the chests of Australians is much needed, or else trust in government will continue to erode more and more.
Daniel, I still have people come up to me that recognise me in the street who lost businesses during those lockdowns, and they're still in tears in 2023, at the end of nearly 2024. You know, 2 years later, they were shattered. They were destroyed. Their kids were locked up at home. They couldn't take them to a playground. I mean, people shouldn't have short memories about this stuff and the bloke who did it to us.
Yeah, that's right, Steve. I think you've touched on a really important point. A lot of our analysis at the time looked at the division. You mentioned small businesses. They were the ones who incurred the cost. It wasn't big businesses or their workers. It wasn't public sector workers. It was private sector workers. It was single mums with 3 kids in a 2-bedroom apartment trying to hold down a job while they're trying to school their 3 kids from home. I mean, they've lost those valuable years of schooling. The social effects, the mental health effects will be with many for a very long time. And what was so challenging, I think, Steve, looking back as a Melburnian who went through it, was so many parts of the media simply refused to provide a different perspective. You were one of the few standouts that gave voice to different opinions in your colleagues at Sky. But look, there were vanishingly few that actually said, hey, there's another way of going about this. We don't need to have these lockdowns and shutting down schools. And this is what happens when you have basically a one-party state with the media backing it in. You end up with very bad long-term public policy problems.
Will, I see you're in New York. I want to talk about Australia Day and the High Commissioner in the UK cancelling. It's now been put back on after an outrage around it. I was lucky enough to be in New York for one of those G'day New York do's put on by Qantas all those years ago. Magnificent big hotel, one of the best hotels in New York. The room was full of Australians who are successful in the United States. I mean, why are we running away from Australia Day overseas, where countries like America with the 4th of July must look at us and go, why are you guys ashamed to be Australia and celebrating Australia Day?
Steve, we've just held the world's first referendum on identity politics, and identity politics was comprehensively smashed. But when will these people learn that these sorts of symbolic virtue signalling acts of quackery aren't popular with mainstream Australia? When will they stop pandering to the 5% of people who just genuinely hate this country? But more than that, how dare Steve Smith? How dare he do this? There are many people overseas who would like to have that opportunity to be able to celebrate Australia with other Australians in that central location in London. How dare he make that decision and take that opportunity away from him? I just can't fathom why these left-leaning politicians continue to make these sorts of decisions despite the incontrovertible evidence that it's not popular with most Australian people.
We'll play Richard Miles in just a moment. But Daniel, I note you're standing on, couldn't be in a more iconic Australian part of the world. You're standing on what looks like a very healthy flowing Murray River. I mean, like you and Will and me, I mean, we're sick and tired of these people telling us we should be ashamed of the fact that we are Australians and that we have Australia Day.
That's right, Steve. I mean, Stephen Smith should be sacked. It's not good enough that he's reinstated it. It should never have happened in the first place. And the fact that the government didn't take quicker action on this tells you everything you need to know about their attitude towards this matter. And Australians have had an absolute gutful of inner city politicians and woke activists every single year that Australia Day rolls around, they try and cancel the day, because what they're doing, Steve, is they don't want Australians to enjoy celebrating our country. They have a lot of self-hatred and cultural self-hatred towards our nation, and Australians are fed up with it. As we've discussed, the overwhelming majority of Australians believe we're a force for good in the world. We're a great nation. We're not perfect, but we're the best place to be, and that's why millions of people want to come here and have come here over the decades. So we need to draw a line under this, and I think Peter Dutton's stance on this has been strong and decisive, and he's got 100% right, and the government needs to act far quicker.
Well, Steve Smith clearly can't read a room. I mean, if you look at the referendum that we had, the yes/no vote, which was overwhelmingly that we would not vote yes, you would have thought Australia Day was something that we should honour. Anyway, it's back on now, so luckily that's a good thing for all of us. I do note COP28. You must have laughed about that, Daniel. I mean, you've got even Al Gore's now saying that at the end of the meeting that everything they did, well, fancy holding it in the UAE for a start, but they're now not going to phase out fossil fuels, and it makes Australia and all of those zealots that were there look ridiculous.
Yeah, it does, Steve. And I think the worm is turning on a lot of these issues as it relates to climate. You just noted before that we're just at the Murray River, we're just at Swan Hill, and we've been around northern Victoria and also in the Riverina in South Australia over the last few days, talking to local farmers and landowners about the transmission lines and the wind turbines and the solar panels that are going to be put on their land in order to meet these net zero targets. And I can tell you the communities don't want this. They're being divided by it. It's immensely concerning from a food security perspective, because if you take up your farmland with solar panels, you're not going to have food that's being produced. So there's significant consequences that come from this. And just like we've been discussing, it's another example of these inner city politicians and bureaucrats that have a big idea of net zero. But when it comes to the practicalities, it's regional Australians who are going to pay the price for that. So let's hope that this is a recognition, Steve, that fossil fuels need to be a part of any normal baseload power future for our nation.
100%. Will, do you think Hunter Biden will get an invite to the White House for Christmas lunch?
I hope so. It would make for good television. Yeah, look, this is a hatchet job. This is Hunter Biden is saying that this is a hatchet job from the Republicans. And he's saying he wouldn't be being prosecuted if his name wasn't Biden. If his name wasn't Biden, he would have been a homeless drug addict, on the street many, many years ago. Look, 2024 is going to be a wild year in American politics, and the Hunter Biden story is just one of many combustible elements, which is something all of us can look forward to as politics nerds.
Yes, and I look forward to your coverage of it next year. Will Kingston and Daniel Wild, thank you very much for your time tonight. Always great to catch up with you both.